Mr. Freeman, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to start with the ultimate question, which is, would you mind sharing how you came to your faith in Christ?
Absolutely. I'd love to. First of all, I want to say thank you for having me. I said that just a second ago, but it's just getting to watch these podcasts. It's been really neat to see the potential impact to the Christian community and the community at large from the things that people are saying. So neat that you're doing this. I appreciate it. I'd love to tell you about my story coming into Christ. It's an interesting one. So I grew up in a home with great parents. They were interesting because one of them was very conservative politically and religiously, and one of them was very liberal politically and religiously. So it made for an interesting upbringing, but both of them loved the Lord, I think kind of in their own ways. But what was interesting is I never really heard the gospel at church when I was a kid. And so go through another piece of that too. I grew up with a brother with intellectual disabilities.
Sure.
And in the process of that, he was older than me, and I'm the youngest of three. In the process of that, the way that I got my parents' attention was by performing well, by doing all the right things and that kind of thing, because obviously a lot of their attention was on him. So part of the story is my focus was on my parents. So then I go off to college, and within 30 minutes of arriving, I went to Baylor in Waco, Texas. Within 30 minutes of arriving on campus, there's already a guy in my dorm room sharing the gospel with me. And I remember saying to him, oh gosh, I get all that. I hadn't heard that before, but I get what you're saying. And so he kind of left me alone. And then, a semester later, I was invited to a Bible study where the gospel was preached regularly and an altar call was given regularly. And of course, I was, had it all figured out. I knew what I was doing, and I, thanks but no thanks. But I'm here to learn. I want to grow in my faith, so on and so forth. Little did I know that I really didn't have much faith. So then this is the crux of it. Summer after I think it was my sophomore year, I went to do, through the PCUSA, a program called Volunteers in Mission. Went to a ranch in New Mexico to work as a college staffer to help with swimming pool lifeguards and summer camp kind of experiences. And when I got there, if you can only imagine, college students from across the nation coming together in one place with really no supervision, the kinds of things that happened and went on. And I remember just thinking to myself as this stuff was happening, and part of this I'm participating in too, thinking, boy, this is not what God would have with me. And it was really cool to realize at that time that I had that realization because my parents weren't with me. There was never a point up to that time where I wasn't either secluded in the cloister of Baylor or at home with my parents. And so it was a free-for-all. So I just remembered thinking, boy, that's what this is. My faith is not in the Lord. My faith is in my parents. And I was a big runner back then, so I walked out of my cabin that morning, and it was my version of falling to my knees, but I sat down on the steps, and I remember, all these times in that Bible study hearing the gospel and what you do to receive Christ. And I remember just bowing my head and praying to receive Christ. God, I all the while I thought I knew you, and I don't, and I want to make that change today. And then going forward, obviously things just like in all of our Christian lives wasn't perfect, but not a time when I haven't seen in all the ups and downs that God wasn't there to honor that, and I continue to place my faith and trust in Him. Yeah.
Were you raised Presbyterian?
I was. Yes.
So you had parents that had different views on what that faith looks like.
Right. Yeah, they both, and I truly believe this. My dad's gone on to be with the Lord, but I know that my dad loved the Lord. My mom is still with us, but they just did it in a different way, and a lot too in. My faith is, I'm not saying this, but my mom would say this, my faith is personal. I don't need to share that with anybody else. And then, so it wasn't shared with me in the home. Then it kind of led to, well, what do I believe then? And all I believed in, like I said, at that point was just my parents, because that's what I did to gain their attention, was just be a good kid.
So your father's perspective was to not share his faith?
No, that wasn't necessarily my dad's perspective. He was the conservative of the two. He had grown up Southern Baptist and really had a bad experience because when he grew up, he'd be about 90 now. But when he grew up, it was the hellfire and brimstone preacher in the pulpit in North Carolina, and it just turned him off. And he regularly talked about that. My mom grew up Presbyterian, and I think he was more than happy to slide into that slot. Just because of his experience growing up.
You mentioned altar call. So that's not a Presbyterian thing, is it?
No, but going to a Baptist university, picked up a lot of the terms there.
It's interesting because I was just actually just recently thinking about that because I go to a Baptist church and there's a lot of altar calls, and I follow a couple of different kind of, I don't want to call them celebrity pastors, but well-known pastors. One of them is Presbyterian, the other one's more Baptist. And I just was listening to the Presbyterian talk about the altar call, and I guess there might be a little bit of a debate there on do we need that in the sermon or at the end of every sermon, or do we not? So I think it's an interesting discussion. Because I think the Baptist point of view here is you want to kind of get them to publicly proclaim this or make this decision, so then maybe it's more of a serious decision.
Yeah, well, I grew up Presbyterian, and yes, I was going to a Baptist university, but I wouldn't have recognized this need in my life if I hadn't been challenged with the gospel and made the decision.
Yeah.
And there wasn't anybody when I sat down on the steps of the cabin, there wasn't anybody there saying, giving me the altar call. I had just remembered, hey, this is the way. And I will tell you, going through that experience, just my personal experience was that was the way, because I had lived 20 years of my life up to that point, and I didn't have that realization of what was going on. So God was absolutely there, and God absolutely worked in my life at that point. Now I go to a Presbyterian church now. We're an EPC church, and every week in the sermon, somewhere in there, the gospel is preached, and then there is essentially an altar call at the end.
So I have to ask, so what was it like? What was it like growing up with an older brother who had special needs?
Oh, phenomenal. Yeah, really, really neat. Back in the day, it was mental retardation. It was intellectual developmental disabilities is what we know it as, but my mom has told me that he is about at the level of a 7-year-old. He lives just down the street from me, and I still help take care of him. But just an awesome guy. What was it like growing up with him? There were times when it was tough. I mean, I would look back now and say, gosh, it was tough having to perform all the time to get my parents' attention. But at the same time, I understand the position they were in, needing to focus on him. But he was my best friend growing up. He was absolutely my best man in our wedding. And even with cousins and family and friends and others that were involved, he was my best man. We had an older sister, so being the two boys in the family, we just connected. And I think a lot of that too it was neat. Part of that connection was I actually got to help him with homework growing up. So he needed help, and there were times when my mom couldn't, and so she just asked me if I would step in and help him. And I was able to do that. And I think that we just grew this appreciation and love for each other through that, and obviously through playing as kids and all the other things that you do. He was much, much bigger than I am, so I got beat up regularly, but that was okay.
Was there anything that you learned from that experience that maybe you took away as an adult?
Oh, absolutely. It's, and we hear it all the time now, especially post-COVID. There's the mental health aspect of what COVID has caused people to go through, but you can never understand or underestimate what somebody's going through. And I tend to, even though I shirk a little bit, like if I see somebody in a grocery store that's disabled in some way, I try to go out of my way to make sure that I'm kind to that person. How can I help you out? Not gawk and stare, whatever that looks like, whatever the temptation is for most people. But it's because I easily could have been that person. And so I just, that's really how, that's translated in my life. And God's used that in a great way too. He's given me, outside of the physical, not gawking at people, he's given me a compassion for people that I think is maybe unique.
Mm. Yeah, as a father of a son with special needs, that really warms my heart because he has a twin sister, and I can see the need or the feeling of I've got to perform at a higher level to get the attention of mom and dad because they're always having to give their attention to the child with special needs.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that your daughter will somewhat experience the same things I did, that there's probably some tension there with that dynamic, but at the same time, she'll grow up loving her brother in a unique and amazing way and come out on the back end of it just being a pro family, pro whoever you are, I don't care, I love you all the same kind of person.
I think it's a blessing. I mean, when you first hear about your child's diagnosis, the last thing you think about, oh wow, this is a blessing. But as time goes on and you kind of get over yourself and how it affects you and all the things that you think that you can't do because of that diagnosis, you start to realize how much of a blessing it is. And it's, every day. I mean, obviously it's scary at times because you think about the future of what happens when he grows up. Is he going to be on his own? Is he going to be able to be on his own? Is he going to live with us forever? Which is fine with me, but it's just a little scary. But I think as I get older and my faith is strengthened, it's only through times like this is how my faith is strengthened.
Absolutely.
Because I got to lean on the Lord during those scary times.
Absolutely. Yeah. And God is good too. I mean, he prepares us as we go. I mean, my sister and I both knew when we were growing up, didn't know what his future looked like, but we knew somehow we were going to be a part of it. That as my parents, moved on with the Lord, that we were going to have to be involved somewhere, and we have been. So
I love that.
Yeah.
As we shift gears here, let's talk business. So how did you become the owner of a CPA firm?
Yeah. So great question. I came out of school, a young whippersnapper CPA, and spent about 8 years doing involuntary servitude with a couple large firms and a small CPA firm, and the 100-hour work weeks just didn't work well. So we stepped aside, my wife and I. Funny story, we were actually having lunch after Easter service on right after my first son had been born. And I was expected to go into the office on Sunday afternoon after Easter services. And we just looked at each other and just said, this is not how we're going to raise our family. So later on that year, left public accounting, went out to work for one of my clients as a director of finance and operations, basically a corporate finance job. And really loved that, went along for 17 years, made a flip after 17 years because of the direction of the company. It had been sold, and worked with the new owner a couple of years, but they weren't really going in a direction that I wanted to go. So I thought, there's more out there for me. Went to work with a friend of mine who had started a business in an old downtown Overland Park, and got to help grow that business for the next 3 or 4 years. And it's funny, didn't realize when you're with one company and in one job for 17 years, how much of your skill set goes to waste. Because I came out of that in the new job thinking I had to start all over again. But anyway, so it was somewhat drinking from a fire hose. But at the same time, I learned a lot, got to, I take this inside of the business experience, and then moved to a job that was really more M&A work. We did a lot of identifying of targets, due diligence type work to build this division that we was with a larger company. We were a division of a larger company, and to build that. And so kind of got both sides of the corporate view, right? Working with one company, working with multiple companies, but then to make a division, but on the corporate side. So after that gig was over, I took some time off just really to pray about what would be next, what would God have me do. And I remember just thinking over and over and over again, boy, I love public accounting, but I can't work 100 hours a week. Man, I really love that, but I can't work 100 hours a week. And so God took me down this road. I called a business broker and said, hey, what do you got in the way of public accounting firms? And she said, this will just give you an idea of who I am. She said, hey, we've got a neat one that's just come on the market out in Lee Summit, and I live in Overland Park. I said, you know what? I started my career in Houston, and my wife and I commuted over an hour one way every day, just not going to go down that road again. And she said to me, well, hang on. Just give me a couple weeks. I think I've got another one coming up. So no joke, Bronson. 2 weeks later, she calls me back, and she says, Doug, I've got one, and it's 1 mile from your home. And I said, let's talk. So I had given her, and this is where the God part comes in. You just, so many components, and I'll just give you a few of them. But I had already given her, this is the criteria that I want in the firm. Everything lined up, down to just everything lined up except for one thing. The firm was about 50% larger than what I was hoping to get to begin with. And it was more an economic thing, just how much money I wanted to put down. But everything else lined up. I thought, boy, this is the Lord calling. I met the owner of the firm. He went to the same college as my dad. My dad went to Western Carolina University. I had never met anybody in my life that had been there. And we just had this immediate connection over that. And then just the connections and the God moments, from that point on were just amazing. Love the guy. He's still with me today, 7 years later.
Working for you now.
Working for me now, yeah. And we just have a fantastic team. And in the process, he wasn't 100 hours a week, but he was probably working 75 or 80 hours a week. And then the staff was anywhere between 50 and 65, if I understand it right. But over the course of 2 or 3 years, we whittled it down and got it down to where during busy season now we're working between 40 and 50, I'll say. And clients have been accepting of that. They realize that, hey, they'd much rather have a tax return done at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, not 3 o'clock in the morning. So it's been a huge blessing, and just again God's provision and His seeing my heart and my desire to do this and providing this way. I mean, He just cleared the way for me to go back into an industry that I love, doing what I love to do. And what's even cooler about this is that I got to take in some new experiences. We've got some great CPA talent in Kansas City, to be sure. Lots of friends of mine that are CPAs and have their firms out there and do great work, but not many of them have worked inside of a business. Most of them are all external, and I've always been public accounting. So it's a flavor that we bring that's really kind of unique. And the guy that I bought the practice from is the same way. He did the same thing, and that was another connecting point that we had. So
that is definitely a unique advantage, because when you have the perspective of the client, because you lived it and you sat in that seat,
right?
I think that's just powerful. I have to ask you, what was your number one requirement when you're looking for a business? Maybe even top 3. Like, what would be one of them?
Well, one of them was proximity, for sure.
Yep.
I'm not going to have a huge commute. Didn't want to do that. I know a big one was the revenue size. And although this wasn't a stated requirement, a huge requirement was the culture. The business broker wasn't going to know the culture, but having done the M&A role, and most people probably get this, but where business combinations or change in executive management happens, one of the most common ways that those efforts get derailed is through culture.
Yeah.
And so I needed to be able to get to know the current owner very, very well, and I did, and we got along famously. I got to ask him about the employees, even though I didn't get to meet them ahead of time. This was a private thing.
Sure.
I didn't get to meet them ahead of time. I was able to talk to some other people. I actually have a neighbor who's good friends with him, and he told me about the employees and all that, and it just sounded like the right thing. But culture was huge. Wasn't required that it was a Christian culture, but it was. It came out that way because he's a practicing Catholic and loves the Lord, so yeah, just an amazing connection. And did I tell you it's only a mile away from my house?
That's very important, because I'm blessed in that way as well. I live pretty close to the business, and a lot of people, I think, don't see, or maybe just overlook that. Because you spend a lot of time on the road, and obviously you can maximize that time with listening to books and such. But so when you own the business, you're going to be a little bit more likely to get in there and fix things when you need to, when it's right down the street.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
It's easy and doesn't stress you out. And you can also leave and go home and have lunch and come back, and so many advantages. With your mergers and acquisitions position, were you guys scouting opportunities to kind of purchase different businesses and add them to your portfolio? Is that what you guys are doing?
Yeah, and the different businesses, we weren't diversifying into other verticals or anything else. It was all just in the business that we were in. There's no reason to be quiet about it. I worked for Underwriters Laboratories. We know them as the electrical testing company out of Chicago. But the business that I was in was kind of the launch business for their digital division. And so we were looking for other businesses around the country that did kind of what we did, but that were taking raw material requirements and digitizing them and making them such that product development and different areas in the corporate and retail world, this information could be used, making it more accessible, more quickly disseminated to the places where it needed to be, and those kind of things.
What were you guys looking for? We're looking at some examples. Obviously, you're going to be looking at good financials of the business, but is there anything else?
Yeah, good financials. Again, cultural fit. Was there? Were the people aligned with kind of the mission of UL? UL's got an interesting mission. They really do have at heart safety. Safety is a huge thing, and so all these businesses really needed to be the same.
So if they had a bunch of daredevils, you're moving on.
Yeah, probably not. If you ride a motorcycle, we are not buying.
Right. Yeah. If you tried to mimic Elon Musk, we're moving on.
That's right. No, I think it was culture. I think it was the desire of the person that owned the business. The smallest acquisition we had was about $2 million. The biggest was about $55 million, okay. and the desire of the owner to work in an equitable way, to stay on, and use his or her skill set going forward.
How long, on average, did you want them to stay on?
Oh, I think there was written in the agreements was usually a 2-year stay over. Yeah.
So when you guys I love this stuff. I'm always thinking about when this happens, what is the most valuable thing you're purchasing when you buy that business? I mean, obviously there are assets, but that's probably not it. Because there's like cents on the dollar usually on those assets.
Yeah, it's what we all know as goodwill or blue sky is what a lot of people like to call it. But what that boils down to in reality is customer lists and processes and things like that. I read an article not long ago, and this applies to any business, that the value of a business can be enhanced by 40% if only the processes and procedures are documented, they've got good accounting, back office things, and that kind of deal. So yeah, you're looking for that. But I'd say the biggest thing is the customer list, what they have. There may be some intellectual property there, which is an intangible. It's not a computer or a desk. But those are the biggest ones. Reputation in the marketplace. Can we come in and buy you with a new executive management team? And two, knowing that you're now a part of Underwriters Laboratories or whoever it is, can we continue your business on? Do we have enough strategic overlap that we can add new value then that will drive new revenue?
So there's never an opportunity where maybe they don't have any of those processes documented, but you do. So you would go in there, implement your processes, and then maybe increase the value of that business?
Could be. I would say culturally, I'd question that, because when you go into a company and say, hey, we've got the UL way and we're going to stamp it on your business, that many times doesn't go over very well.
Because the people are just using it, doing it however they want.
That's right.
And now you're going to tell them, hey, follow this process. And like, I'm not following no process. I'm doing it the way I've always done it.
That's right. And I think a better way to do that would be to go in and convince them that, hey, this is something that we need to do, because we're now a bigger organization. And it was really a number of businesses coming together to kind of act as one, even though they each had kind of their own mission and product and service. But then to learn about each other, having those things defined, really helped out. I wouldn't think that we would have gone in and acquired somebody like that.
So then with the processes, do you guys let them keep just doing their own process, or do you try to add yours, replace with yours?
At that point, it's best practices. It's let's look across the field of our business, of the different businesses that we've acquired. There are some things that are going to be unique to that business that them continuing with that process is not going to upset the apple cart anywhere else. So what do? You leave it alone. You change very little from the beginning. I marvel at people that buy businesses and the first thing they want to do is change the logo. Really? That's the most important thing you can think of right now is to change the logo. But you leave those things alone that are working. Actually, you leave everything alone for a while. But then you do some analysis, and whatever needs to have more continuity across the businesses, those are the things that you kind of find the best practices and then implement those. And sometimes there's a little resistance. There's going to be with anything like that. But generally, if you can get people to buy into that and see how it's going to work for the greater good, they're more than happy to change. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say if the employees are used to following a process, if you come in and say, hey, we got a better one, they're already used to following a process, and maybe they would like following a better one.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's a great point. I mean, to your question earlier of would you ever buy a company that had no processes? That would be another reason not to do that, because then you're trying to sell a process to somebody who has no process, and that probably doubly wouldn't work well.
That's very interesting. So now you are an owner of the business. How long has it been?
7 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
What are the most common errors small business owners make with their bookkeeping?